To make sure. Max, the first part of the middle is. The speakers from here. Yeah, no, I'm saying I want the speaker where you are. You go there. All right. No, that's good. All right.
Good afternoon. I'm Jessica Berg, the Dean here at the Law School, and it is my privilege to introduce our 2018 Melman Lecture. The lecture is named in honor of Professor Max Mehlman, who joined the university in 1984, became the director of the Law Medicine Center in 1987, and in 2013 was named a Distinguished University Professor, which is our university's highest honor. Max's extraordinary work here prompted the generous anonymous donation by the family of an alum of the class of 1998, establishing this named lecture series in health law. The series allows us to bring in high-profile speakers in health law, all of whom are graduates of our school. Please join me in thanking our sponsor. I'm now pleased to introduce our 2018 Melman Lecturer, Seth Jacobs. Seth received his undergraduate degree from the University of Rochester, in slightly better weather, where he majored in biology and English. At Case Western Reserve University, he took courses in medicine and public health, in addition to law, and graduated with his JD in 1981. Perhaps more importantly from his perspective, he also met his wife, Julie, here, also a 1981 graduate, and she joins us today. After working at law firms in Ohio and Michigan, Seth joined Metra Health, which at the time was the largest health insurer in the country. When it was bought by United Healthcare in 1996, Seth and Julie decided to move to California, where he became the first in-house general counsel at Blue Shield of California and the youngest general counsel in the entire national Blue Cross Blue Shield system. 21 years later, as Senior Vice President and General Counsel, he oversees the legal department that he built with 18 attorneys and over 100 staff members. Blue Shield is now the largest insurer on the California Affordable Care Act exchange, providing employer, individual, and government insurance, including Medicaid, to 4 million people. Seth is proud of his organization's outspoken progressive leadership in the American healthcare system. It was the first health insurer in the country to press for universal health care. In the mid-1990s, he even drafted a bill that was introduced in the California legislature to establish universal health care for that state. Although it didn't pass, it did serve as one of the blueprints for the Affordable Care Act. Please join me in welcoming Seth Jacobs, who will speak on All Nonprofits Are Not Created Equal, the role of the commercial nonprofit.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Well, before launching in, I do want to say how grateful my wife Julie and I are to be back in this wonderful place. As Dean Berg said, we met here on the first day of law school in 1978, and we were married in August of 1979. So this is a very romantic place for us, in addition to being the place that enabled us to do exactly the type of legal work that we were hoping to pursue when we were here. For Julie, that was management side traditional labor law, and in her law practice, she got to represent some of the biggest unionized manufacturing companies in the world. And for me, it was health law, and I got to represent some of the biggest health insurers in the world. So thank you, Case Western Reserve, for making our lives sweet. And thank you, Professor Mehlman, Dean Berg, Dean Scharf, Assistant Dean Pash, and Patty Harbold for inviting us back here and giving us this honor. Thank you so much. So there are just 3 points I want to make for you today. First, all nonprofits are not the same. Second, the differences matter. And third, the commercial nonprofit might be the best way to organize new healthcare ventures. You can tell me at the end whether you agree, but I think it might be. So let's start with a few well-known brands and see how well you really know them. So everybody knows who this is, right? A National Football League. This is the organizing body for professional football. In 2015, the NFL's total revenue was about $7.2 billion. So first question, for-profit or nonprofit? Is the NFL a for-profit organization or is it a nonprofit organization? Who thinks it's for-profit? It is nonprofit. It is a nonprofit unincorporated association controlled by the 32 NFL teams. Second question, taxable or tax-exempt? All right. Who thinks it's taxable? Well, you're all right in a way. The NFL was exempt from federal income tax until 2015. That was when it voluntarily relinquished its federal tax exemption and became a taxable entity. So it's taxable today. Roger Goodell was the commissioner of the NFL at the time, and he said the tax exemption had become a distraction, that having to repeatedly explain and justify the exemption was just too time-consuming. It happened to be worth about $10 million a year. And he said almost all of the revenue is passed through to the team owners and taxed at that level anyway, so the tax exemption really wasn't worth that much. Well, some people thought maybe his explanation lacked complete candor, that the real reason for dropping the exemption was that the NFL team owners didn't want the NFL to keep having to file the exempt organization tax returns, which, as you probably know, contain detailed disclosures, including how much Roger Goodell was being paid. So, whatever the real reasons, being an exempt organization does carry some burdens that, at least for the NFL, outweighed the benefits. Okay, third question. When the NFL was tax exempt, so prior to 2015, was the basis for the exemption that it was a charity? Was it exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code? Who thinks it was a charity? Nobody. Right, you are. The NFL was exempt under Section 501c6 of the Internal Revenue Code as a business league. And by the way, Major League Baseball, MLB, is also a taxable nonprofit, but the National Hockey League, the NHL, is tax exempt. Go figure. Okay, everybody knows who Kaiser is, right? It's the 8th largest health insurer in the country by membership. Its 2017 annual revenue was about $72 billion. Same questions. Is Kaiser for-profit or nonprofit? Who thinks Kaiser's for-profit? Wow, Kaiser's doing a great job. Kaiser Foundation Health Plan is a nonprofit corporation. Who thinks it is tax exempt? Few people. It is tax exempt. Charity or non-charity? Who thinks Kaiser is a charity? Handful of people. Kaiser is a public charity exempt from federal income tax under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So Kaiser earns its C3 status because it's both a health insurer and a healthcare provider. It owns and controls its own hospitals and medical group and directly delivers healthcare services to its members. It is like a staff model HMO, unlike health plans that just contract with a network of independent hospitals and doctors. Network health plans that are tax exempt are generally exempt as 501c4 social welfare organizations. Okay? Last one. Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield of Ohio. The Ohio Blue Plan is the 5th largest health insurer in the state. Its 2017 annual revenue was about $1.5 billion. For-profit or non-profit? Who thinks it's for-profit? The Ohio Blue Plan is a for-profit corporation. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Anthem, Inc., a for-profit publicly traded holding company that operates Blue Plans in 14 states. Anthem, Inc.'s 2017 annual revenue was about $89 billion. It's the 2nd largest health insurer in America by membership. So I won't ask you the other 2 questions. Clearly, the Ohio Blue Plan, like its parent, is a taxable non-charity. And I'll give you one other side note about the Blues. There are 36 independent Blue Plans in the U.S., although there are Blue Plans in all 50 states. Some are affiliates of larger companies like the Ohio Blue Plan, so I'm counting the affiliated entities as one. And of the 36 independent Blue Plans, 34 are taxable nonprofit corporations. So 3 points I want to highlight from these illustrations. First, organizations that perform the same basic services in the same markets aren't always the same from a legal organizational point of view. And second, it can be very hard to tell from the outside what type of organization it is. And third, even when people know the differences on some dimensions, say the difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit company, they're still often confused on some other dimensions, say the difference between a taxable and a tax-exempt company, or the difference between a charity and a non-charity. So now I want to tell you the story of the 2015 acquisition of Care First Health Plan by Blue Shield of California. I think it's a case study in the pervasive confusion among some very sophisticated people between these basic distinctions: for-profit, nonprofit, taxable, tax-exempt, charitable, non-charitable. So first, a few facts about Blue Shield of California. Blue Shield's mission is to ensure that all Californians have access to high-quality care at an affordable price. Pretty great mission, in my view. Blue Shield's 2017 annual revenue was about $18 billion. It has about 4 million members. It's the 7th largest Blue Plan in America and the 3rd largest health plan in California by membership. It is independent. It isn't owned or controlled by anyone. And it isn't the same as Blue Cross of California. They are 2 completely separate companies. Blue Cross of California is one of the 14 Blue Plans owned by Anthem. So, if you are confused about the differences between Blue Cross and Blue Shield, you are not alone. If this lecture were titled "All Blues Are Not Created Equal," I would try to explain the differences, but that's another topic for another day, and you can ask me questions later if you want to. I'm happy to answer them. So there are 5 types of nonprofit entities described in the California Corporations Code: public benefit corporations, religious corporations, mutual benefit corporations, nonprofit limited liability corporations, and nonprofit associations. Blue Shield of California is a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation. Now, that's not to be confused with a mutual insurance company. Mutual insurance companies are a creature of the insurance code, and a mutual insurance company is a form of for-profit corporation owned by its policyholders. Blue Shield is not one of those. Until 1987, Blue Shield was exempt from federal income tax. In the Tax Reform Act of 1986, Congress stripped all Blue plans of their federal tax exemptions and made them subject to federal tax just like commercial insurers, with some transition provisions to ease them into full taxability. But the state of California never conformed its tax code to the 1986 federal code changes, and Blue Shield remained exempt from the state corporate income tax, which we call the franchise tax. The basis for both the federal and the state tax exemptions was that Blue Shield is a social welfare organization described in Section 501c(4) of the federal code and the state code equivalent. Blue Shield was never a public charity and never held any assets in charitable trust. So in August of 2014, the state taxing authority, which is called the Franchise Tax Board, notified Blue Shield that, in its opinion, Blue Shield was no longer organized or being operated for social welfare purposes and revoked Blue Shield's state tax exemption. And like other actions of the taxing authority, the revocation notice was not a public document, nor was Blue Shield's protest of the revocation. So here's where things stood at the end of 2014. Blue Shield is and always has been a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation. It is and always has been a non-charity. It has been a federal taxpayer since 1987, and it's newly taxable at the state level. So in December of 2014, Blue Shield signed an agreement to acquire Care First Health Plan for $1.2 billion. Care First is a 450,000 member Medi-Cal managed care plan. Medi-Cal is the California version of Medicaid. And Care First was a privately held, for-profit stock corporation. And as part of the transaction, Blue Shield committed to converting Care First into a nonprofit corporation. Now, health plan mergers and acquisitions in California are subject to the approval of the California Department of Managed Healthcare, or DMHC. And Blue Shield made all the necessary regulatory filings, which are public documents, and made public announcements of the planned acquisition. And that's when things started to get really confusing. An unhappy former employee of Blue Shield named Michael Johnson, who had been Blue Shield's Director of Public Policy, decided to leak the tax revocation to the Los Angeles Times. And that created a media frenzy. Here's the headline of the LA Times story by Chad Terhune, someone I became very familiar with over the years. Not just Blue Shield loses its state tax exemption, but also with billions in the bank. Thanks, Chad, for that. Here's an article from the San Francisco Chronicle, the same day by Vicki Colliver. At least Vicki left off the billions in the bank part, but she did kind of veer off the cliff with this comment. Officials from the tax board would not explain why they took the action in August, but critics have long accused the insurer, until now classified as a nonprofit, of acting like a for-profit. Well, Vicki was more than a little confused, I think, when she wrote that the loss of exempt status meant that the company was no longer nonprofit, but that is what she wrote. Now, take a careful look at this notice. Don't worry, I'm going to blow it up a little bit for you. From the San Francisco Office of the Treasurer and Tax Collector. This letter was sent on March 18, 2015, the same day as the Chronicle article. Now look what it says in the upper right-hand corner. Right? Nonprofit status revoked. Now you would think that the city treasurer and tax collector would know the difference between revoking a tax exemption and revoking nonprofit status, but no. And about a month later, in a bylined article in the Sacramento Bee written by Michael Johnson, he said, Blue Shield is incorporated as a nonprofit social welfare organization. As such, it is owned by the public, and in exchange for the tax exemption, Blue Shield is obligated to serve the public's interest exclusively. Now, I can tell you, this report that Blue Shield is owned by the public was big news to us, okay? And it happens to be completely wrong. So others piled on. Consumers Union and other consumer interest groups asked for a public hearing to air the public's interest in Blue Shield's nonprofit assets. So the news media coverage, consumer group allegations, and regulator inquiries all placed the burden on Blue Shield to unravel the general misconception that nonprofit equals tax-exempt equals public charity. We had to convince people that those are not all the same thing. We had to prove that even if you lose your tax exemption, you can still be nonprofit. And we had to prove that every nonprofit isn't a public charity. So in California, if you propose to convert a nonprofit health plan into a for-profit health plan, and the nonprofit health plan is a charitable entity, then the nonprofit health plan must contribute the entire value of the enterprise to another charitable entity in order to get approval of the conversion transaction. So it's sort of a codification of the common law charitable trust notion that charitable assets must remain in charitable solution. In 1996, Blue Cross of California converted from a nonprofit charity into a for-profit publicly traded company named WellPoint. And in that transaction, Blue Cross was required to contribute $3.2 billion to two newly created charitable foundations, the California Healthcare Foundation and the California Endowment. So if the Care First transaction were considered a conversion of Blue Shield from nonprofit to for-profit, and if Blue Shield were determined to be a charity, the set-aside or charitable contribution required could have been in excess of $15 billion. Well, in the end, the DMHC determined that the transaction was not a conversion of Blue Shield from nonprofit to for-profit, that Blue Shield was not a charity and held no assets in charitable trust, that the revocation of Blue Shield's state franchise tax exemption was irrelevant, and it approved the acquisition of Care First as we had proposed it. So how do you prove? How do you prove that you're not a charity when Consumers Union and the California Public Interest Research Group and Health Access and all these others are telling the regulator that you are? Well, you have to scour nearly everything that the company and its founders ever said on the subject, all the way back to when the company was formed in 1939. You have to look at every word of the original articles of incorporation and bylaws and every amendment to those documents over time. Is there a charitable dedication clause or anything that refers to a charitable purpose or a public benefit obligation? And if there isn't anything like that in the organic documents, then you look at secondary evidence, like company statements in published articles, in court testimony, in court decisions, in legislation, legislative history, consumer communications, and so on. A lot of documents. In a legal memo written by Consumers Union to the DMHC as part of the public hearing process, Consumers Union quoted extensively from a 1939 article in a legal journal written by Blue Shield's outside counsel about the founding of Blue Shield. Well, a nice piece of research by Consumers Union, but there was no evidence in any of these documents that Blue Shield was formed as a charity or ever held itself out as being a charity. It was always intended as a quid pro quo. People pay dues or premiums, and the company provides coverage. Some takeaways from this case study. Well, first, clearly, at the beginning of this process, neither the public, nor the news media, nor the regulators, nor just about anyone understood that nonprofit doesn't equal tax-exempt, doesn't equal charitable. It took 9 months of regulatory filings and public hearings to sort that out. Second, these differences matter. In this case, it mattered $15 billion worth. The health plan conversion statutes that I described, California is just one state that has those. There certainly aren't the only laws that differentiate among types of nonprofits and impose very different consequences depending on the flavor. For example, the Affordable Care Act created an annual fee on health insurance providers. This year, the total fee on all health insurance providers in the country will be over $14 billion. The Act gives some special exemptions to the fee to certain nonprofit health insurers, depending on what type of nonprofit you are. If you're a nonprofit health insurer whose earnings don't inure to private individuals, who doesn't do too much lobbying, who doesn't campaign for political candidates, and whose earnings are at least 80% from Medicare and Medicaid, then you don't have to pay any health insurer fee at all. And you don't need to be exempt from federal income tax to get this break from the health insurer fee. You do need to behave in certain respects like a 501c3 exempt organization to get the break, but you don't have to be one. You can be a taxable commercial nonprofit and still get this break. And if you are exempt because you're a 501c3 or you're a 501c4, you basically get a 50% reduction in your health insurer fee, but you do have to pay the rest. The differences between nonprofit organizations also matter because the nonprofit sector matters to the overall economy and to a lot of people. Nonprofits represent about 5.5% of the U.S. gross domestic product. 1 in 10 workers in the U.S. is employed by a nonprofit. The nonprofit sector is the 3rd largest employer in the U.S. after retail and manufacturing. Healthcare is the largest industry within the nonprofit sector in terms of economic value and employment. In 2016, there were nearly 1.6 million tax-exempt nonprofit organizations. And about 30% of those are not charities. In fact, about 82,000 nonprofits are social welfare organizations, and there are 25 other categories of tax-exempt organizations in the Internal Revenue Code that are not charities. They're things like civic leagues and chambers of commerce and fraternal benefit societies and credit unions. This data that I just talked about is almost all from the Internal Revenue Service, the National Center for Charitable Statistics, and the Urban Institute. And just about all their data is from reports filed by tax-exempt entities. So you would be hard-pressed, as was I, to find data on the economic impact of taxable nonprofits alone. We know it's substantial, even considering just the taxable nonprofits that I've mentioned here. Almost all the blue plans in America, all the AAA automobile clubs around the country are taxable nonprofits, and there are many, many others. The collective database of nonprofit economic data itself is further evidence of the blurring of these lines between types of nonprofits. So, what is the defining characteristic of a nonprofit organization? It's not being tax exempt. It's not being a charity. It's not having a public benefit or being owned by the public. So what is it? It is the non-distribution constraint, the defining characteristic of nonprofit organizations, and the difference between nonprofits and for-profits is that nonprofits can't pay dividends or otherwise make distributions of net earnings to persons in control. Net earnings have to be retained inside the organization and devoted to the production of the services that the organization was formed to provide. Nonprofits can't be organized for the purpose of maximizing financial returns to owners. So they're organized for the purpose of maximizing the achievement of their mission or business purpose. Nonprofits are mission maximizers, not profit maximizers. And the mission can be any lawful purpose. Laundromats and car washes can be organized as nonprofit organizations. I would say that maximizing the number of clean cars is an entirely permissible purpose for a nonprofit corporation, but why organize a car wash as a nonprofit? I think the most important reason to organize any enterprise as a nonprofit is trust. When the consumer is vulnerable, because the quality of an essential service is very hard to judge, and the market is inefficient, because the consumer can't effectively compare cost and quality to determine value. The consumer then needs to have a high degree of trust in the supplier of the service. The non-distribution constraint helps to create that trust. It places controls on the perceived and the actual conflict between profit maximization on the one hand and price and quality of services on the other hand. It isn't the tax status of the enterprise that reduces conflicts and creates trust. All nonprofits, whether taxable or tax-exempt, are subject to the non-distribution constraint. It is governance. The board and management of a nonprofit organization must evaluate every business decision based on whether it will maximize the achievement of the company's mission, not whether it will maximize profit. So, from the consumer's perspective, that means management of the nonprofit enterprise is more focused on the consumer's best interests and less on management's own personal financial interests than management would be in a for-profit enterprise. It doesn't always work that way. There are lots of reasons why the non-distribution constraint alone doesn't eliminate all conflicts. Two examples. While the board of a nonprofit, the board might be very clear on its duty to maximize mission rather than profit, members of management might not be as clear, sort of a principal and agent problem. And incentive compensation plans for management might also be out of alignment and motivate management to seek excess profits to enhance their bonuses. There has certainly been a lot said about executive compensation at all companies, including nonprofits, mostly about CEO pay. I mentioned Kaiser earlier. Its CEO, Bernard Tyson, was paid about $6 million in 2015, and to some, that seems inconsistent with Kaiser's nonprofit status. I think the legally defensible point of view is that the reasonableness of nonprofit and for-profit CEO pay should be judged objectively based on the market rate of pay for comparable positions at comparable companies using independent survey data as determined by an independent governance process. I think that good governance and proper talent acquisition practices significantly dampen both these principal and agent and compensation problems. So just before we get back to the car wash example for a second, I want to point out that in 1980, Professor Henry Hansman wrote an article in the Yale Law Journal entitled "The Role of Nonprofit Enterprise." Many people, including me, view this as the seminal work in the field of nonprofit organizations, and I think for the law students here particularly, if these problems we're talking about today are of interest to you, Professor Hansman's article is a good place to start your research. The citation is 89 Yale Law Journal 835. So back to the car wash example. I think there's a fairly efficient market for car wash services. I think it's easy to tell whether your car is clean when it comes out of the wash, and if it isn't clean, your health and safety probably aren't at risk. I think competition among car washes is likely to produce low prices and high quality. And that's just not the case for other types of services, particularly healthcare services. We all know how difficult it is to comparison shop for healthcare services. And although the tools are improving, most people don't know what a healthcare service cost them until weeks or months after the service was rendered. And when you have an urgent need for healthcare, shopping is the last thing on your mind. and healthcare quality is just very hard to measure for most consumers. So what do we know about cost and quality differences between for-profit and nonprofit healthcare plans and providers? Are nonprofit hospitals earning consumers' trusts with higher quality and lower cost? Well, I'm going to talk about two types of trust: earned trust and granted trust. Trust is earned by fulfilling your commitments. When you fulfill your commitments, you provide evidence that you can be trusted. Trust is granted when you assume that it will be earned. Trust is granted before there's specific evidence, either because there's general evidence, like reputation for trustworthiness, or there is some benefit to granting trust, like reciprocity, the hope that if you grant it, you'll also receive it. So let's first talk about earned trust. Is there evidence that nonprofit hospitals are earning consumers' trust with higher quality and lower cost? It is very hard to tell, in my view. And we'll look at this data in a second, but I need to acknowledge that there is a lot of data available on most of these subjects, and even more opinions. The topics of healthcare cost and quality and the presence and impacts of trust in healthcare have been extensively studied. What I want to show you here is what I find persuasive in the literature that's readily accessible by most people. And I'm hoping that it will at least pique your interest, and you can always delve more deeply if you want. So here's some hospital cost data. Of the top 10 most profitable hospitals in America, 7 are nonprofit. But of the 50 hospitals with the highest cost to charge ratio, how much they mark up their prices, 98% are for-profit. So that data is a little mixed. Look at some hospital quality data. U.S. News ranks just about everything, including hospitals. And what it says is that all of the hospitals in the 2018 U.S. News Top 20 Best Hospitals Honor Roll, all are nonprofit. Nice showing for the nonprofits there. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, runs the Medicare and Medicaid programs within the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. CMS rates hospitals on a variety of quality measures and summarizes the ratings for consumers by giving hospitals a star rating, and 5 stars is their best rating. CMS also does this for health plans that are Medicare managed care plans. So of all the hospitals CMS rated, 634 were for-profit, and 48 of those, or 8%, were rated 5 stars. CMS rated 2,224 nonprofit hospitals, and of those, 230, or 10%, were rated 5 stars. So the nonprofits eked out a slight edge there. What about health plans? Here's some health plan cost and price data. A study published by the research firm Health Pocket compared health insurance premiums of nonprofit and for-profit health plans in 6 major U.S. cities. The study found that in 47% of the comparisons, a city's nonprofit plans had the lowest average premium within a given deductible range, and for-profit plans had the lowest premium in 39% of comparisons. The study also found that in 56% of the comparisons, nonprofits had the lowest out-of-pocket maximums for an enrollee who have to pay their own financial liability for covered services. So now some health plan quality data. Back to U.S. News. U.S. News says there are 66 health plans in the country that have earned its highest rating of 5 stars. And of those 66 plans, only 10 are for-profit. And here are the Medicare Stars results for health plans. There were 19 Medicare Advantage plans in the U.S. that earned a 5-star rating for 2019, and of those, only 5 are for-profit. I said there was a lot of data out there about healthcare cost and quality, but there is virtually no data segregating taxable nonprofits from tax-exempt nonprofits. That means there's no data isolating the effects of the non-distribution constraint from other characteristics like tax status. But there is a 2013 study comparing premiums charged by nonprofit blue plans before and after they converted to for-profit. Because these companies were taxable, both before and after conversion, you can infer that if prices changed post-conversion, it was related to their corporate status and not their tax status, okay? The study found that when the converting blue plan had large market share, it raised prices significantly post-conversion. The authors concluded that a for-profit health plan was more likely than a nonprofit health plan to exploit pricing advantages resulting from large market share. So, as I said, there is lots more data and plenty to debate on these topics, but just considering these studies, I think it's fair to say that there's evidence that nonprofits are maybe marginally better than for-profits at creating value for consumers in terms of cost and quality. But irrespective of whether we can prove this value difference, there is good evidence that consumers believe the difference exists. Studies suggest that consumers grant trust to nonprofit healthcare organizations more than they do to for-profit ones. So in a study of consumer beliefs about nonprofit hospitals and health plans, published in Health Affairs in 2014, roughly 2/3 of survey respondents expected ownership form to be related to trustworthy practices. And on almost all measures, nonprofits were more trusted than for-profits by a margin of 11-1. And consumers grant trust even though most of them don't really understand exactly what it means to be nonprofit. So now I have an appeal to make. So I suspect many of you are advising or will be advising a new generation of healthcare entrepreneurs. Our healthcare industry is in urgent need of transformation. We need to bring healthcare into the digital age and make the consumer experience more like what we experience in almost all other aspects of our lives. We need to make healthcare transactions more like buying something on Amazon or doing banking online. So there are two things that I would ask you to do as you take a role in creating the new healthcare economy. First, help make meaning of these differences among nonprofits. You are in the best position to inform and educate opinion leaders, policymakers, legislators, and your business clients about the essential nature of nonprofits and how they differ from for-profits and from each other. And the second thing that I would ask is that when you're organizing these new healthcare ventures, consider forming them as commercial nonprofits. There's already a trend toward forming new ventures as nonprofits. In the 10-year period between 2001 and 2011, the number of nonprofit businesses grew 25%, while the number of for-profit businesses grew only 0.5%. And even highly entrepreneurial, financially motivated people are seeing the benefits of organizing new healthcare ventures as nonprofits. Who would have thought? Who would have thought the CEOs of Amazon, JP Morgan, and Berkshire Hathaway would create a nonprofit company to solve the healthcare crisis? Jeff Bezos, who's, as you know, Amazon's CEO, said in the announcement of this joint venture that the healthcare system is complex, and we enter into this challenge open-eyed about the degree of difficulty. Hard as it might be, reducing healthcare's burden on the economy, while improving outcomes for employees and their families, would be worth the effort. And they also announced that their new venture would be, quote, free from profit-making incentives and constraints. Wow, uncharacteristic language from the heads of these organizations who typically wouldn't call the profit motive a constraint. And although the planned tax status of the new venture wasn't announced, I doubt that it will be an exempt entity, at least not initially. And I can't think of a more mercenary, forgive me, industry than pharma, but here are two recent nonprofit startups in the drug business. When Intermountain Healthcare, the nonprofit Salt Lake City Hospital group that spearheaded the effort to form Civica, announced the idea, it said it intended to go into the drug business as a shot across the bow of the bad guys. 7 organizations, representing about 500 U.S. hospitals, will lead the new venture. They plan to manufacture 14 hospital-administered generic drugs and compete with the generic drug manufacturers to increase the supply and lower the cost of these drugs. And although the public statements don't go into the details about the company's tax status, look at this language from their press release. It says they want to safeguard the company's social welfare mission. Well, that certainly hints at an intention, I think, to seek an exemption as a C4 social welfare organization. But it also says we are creating a public asset. Remember what I said about proving that you're not a public charity. If the founders of Civica don't want to impress their assets with a charitable trust, I think they should be more careful about what they say in their press releases. And then there's harm reduction therapeutics. Now, observers are a little bit more skeptical about this one. The mission of the new nonprofit company is to produce a cheaper form of naloxone, the opioid overdose antidote. So the irony here is that the new company is completely funded by Purdue Pharma, one of the largest producers of OxyContin. Look, if this proves anything, right, I think it's that Purdue understands this research about how consumers trust nonprofits more than for-profits. Now, this company isn't going to be tax-exempt either. Okay, here's my last example of a nonprofit healthcare startup, and one that I helped to form. A few years ago, Blue Shield of California came to the conclusion that creating a comprehensive digital patient health record that would be available to your healthcare provider real-time at the point of service was essential to improving quality and lowering cost. And to create that real-time comprehensive digital health record required health information sharing among all the players in the system: health plans, hospitals, doctors, clinics, pharmacies, everybody. There was no existing organization doing statewide comprehensive health information exchange involving all these players. So Blue Shield decided to create one. And one of the guiding principles was that the health information exchange should be like a public utility. It should be open to all healthcare providers and plans to improve healthcare for everybody and not to produce a financial return to its founders. But it would require substantial capital to create and operate the organization. I'm talking about in the multiple tens of millions of dollars. So what form of organization would be best? Well, one of the limitations of nonprofit corporations that we didn't discuss is that they have no access to equity capital. Nonprofits can't raise capital by selling stock to investors. But there are other effective ways for nonprofits to raise capital. And in the case of our Health Information Exchange, which we named Cal Index, we formed it as a nonprofit mutual benefit corporation. It had 2 founders who became the first 2 corporate members. Corporate members are people who have certain fundamental corporate rights, like electing the board of directors and approving major business changes. The 2 founders were Blue Shield of California and Anthem Blue Cross of California, one nonprofit and one for-profit. And Cal Index was capitalized by a combination of grants and loans from the founders. That gave Cal Index sufficient capital to meet its needs for many years. So being a nonprofit didn't limit the company's access to capital. In fact, it facilitated it by giving the founders sufficient control to assure that they could help make it successful, while at the same time creating trust among the other necessary players that the venture was truly going to be a public utility and not a profit-making opportunity for the founders. Today, Cal Index, which is now named Manifest MedX, is the largest health information exchange in California. So this is where we started. Where do we go from here? Well, if you believe the data, maybe you want to consider getting your health care from a nonprofit system. I don't know. But maybe just as important, you might want to get involved in a nonprofit organization as an advisor, as a board member, as an employee. And I'm not necessarily talking about a charity, although that's certainly a good thing to do. But it can be very rewarding to work with a commercial nonprofit no matter what business it's in. If you believe in the mission of that business, the nonprofit form of organization will enable you to place that mission at the heart of your work. Nonprofit organizations also tend to seek out and screen for people who share the values associated with pursuing the organization's mission. Working with people who share a set of common values can be a reason in itself to get involved in a nonprofit business. It certainly has been for me. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. I do believe we have time for questions. Do we have the microphone in the back? Great. So if you don't mind waiting for the microphone to come over, I think there was a hand right over here. Come on.
Thank you. You made a strong case for the commercial nonprofit in terms of the mission orientation that you just referred to a moment ago. But I'm perhaps a little bit cynical, and I hope not too cynical, but I'm concerned about accountability for the fulfillment of that mission or not.
Yeah.
I can think of some examples where it appeared to me that nonprofit boards may have strayed from the mission.
Yeah.
What in the commercial for-profit company, of course, management is accountable to the board, and the board is accountable to the shareholders, at least on the narrow view, and the markets, particularly the securities market, as well as the shareholder voting mechanism, theoretically, debatable how well that works or how effectively that works, but it's there. Who are the board members, who I assume are mostly self-perpetuating, of commercial nonprofits accountable to, and how does that accountability work in practice? And can you cite some examples of it working well?
Sure. Yeah. Boy, I've thought a lot about that. I think it's a great point. And like I said, the non-distribution constraint by itself isn't enough and doesn't always work perfectly. But here's how it would work. Okay? In a commercial nonprofit that has corporate members, like the Cal Index example, corporate members have rights like shareholders. They don't own the company, they have no equity interest, but under the Nonprofit Corporation Code, corporate members can bring a derivative action on behalf of the corporation. So if the directors were violating their fiduciary duties, including violating the non-distribution constraint, the corporate members could bring a derivative action against the directors. So that's one type of enforcement. If the nonprofit is tax exempt, then I think you have inurement prohibitions that tend to significantly dampen the likelihood of violating a non-distribution constraint, because inurement is very analogous to non-distribution. But in a commercial nonprofit that's taxable, the enforcement of non-distribution constraint is weak. So if you have no corporate members, nobody can bring a derivative action. If the directors make an unlawful distribution, I suppose the Secretary of State could revoke your charter. I mean, it is a statutory violation. I've never seen that happen. The Attorney General could bring an action on behalf of the state, not because the Attorney General has supervision over the nonprofit, because in almost every state, including Ohio, the Attorney General doesn't have supervision unless there's a charitable trust obligation. But the violation of the statute, the underlying Corporations Code provision that says distributions are illegal, could be a basis for enforcement by the Attorney General under a theory that it was just a violation of law. The other directors can bring an action in the name of the corporation, even if there are no corporate members. And I've pretty much run out of examples of how the non-distribution constraint would be enforced. So I'll tell you what really happens, like in my experience. Okay? And I've been seeing this firsthand for a very long time in several corporations. The enforcement of the non-distribution constraint is by virtue of the individual director's reputation and interest in their own reputation for honesty and integrity. And these are people who are, by and large, independent. At least they are at Blue Shield and every other Blue plan because there's a requirement. Independent means they're not employees of the company. They don't sell services to the company, so they have no affiliation with the company. They have no interest in maximizing profits. So if the directors are abiding by their duties and they really do care about their own reputation and the reputation of the organization, they're going to do the right thing. So cynical, understood. It doesn't always work, but I would say, by and large, in my experience, it does.
You talked about the terrific confusion about nonprofits. Another area of confusion is self-insured versus insured. Can you talk a little bit about your business, 4 million? I don't know if there are half of them are self-insured, whatever they are. And secondly, the legal freedom you have of not having to comply with a state insurance law.
Sure.
Doing innovative things like value-based payment.
Yeah,
self-insured.
Yeah, we think about that a lot as well. Whether you're for-profit or non-profit, as a health plan or as an insurer, there's basically two kinds of ways to fund health insurance. Your employer could basically be the insurer. When your employer is the insurer, your employer takes the risk of, the cost of health care. That's something we call self-funded or self-insured. Sometimes it's called administrative services only because the health plan is just providing administrative services and not insurance. The other form of funding is the employer pays the health plan a fixed periodic prepayment, a premium, which is an estimate of what the cost of health care would be. But if the cost of health care exceeds what the employer pays, the insurer takes the risk that cost of care is higher than what the insurer paid. And you're familiar with that because at least most people buy insurance and they only self-insure to the extent that they have like a deductible on their policy. So if you sell self-insured products to big employers, mostly because they want to take the risk and they don't want to shift the risk to the insurer, there's a lot of laws that will not apply, like state insurance laws will not apply to that arrangement because they're preempted by federal law. And there are also differences in the kinds of benefits that a self-insured employer has to offer under the Affordable Care Act compared to a fully insured employer. So there's more flexibility on the part of the insurer and the employer on the self-insured arrangement, but there's more risk for the employer. They're taking all the risk. So the Blues are big time into selling administrative services to self-funded employers. It's a growing market because those employers are interested in that flexibility.
But nationally, it's like 50%. What is of your 4 million
Yeah,
companies?
we're way on the low side compared to the big Blue plans on our percentage of self-funded. I mean, Blue Shield grew up as a traditional insurance company, and almost all of its business was traditional, fully insured business. Like Dean Berg said at the beginning, we're the biggest healthcare insurer on the exchange. That's individual and small group. That's not self-insured. That's fully insured business. That's by far the preponderance of our book of business.
I think we can squeeze one more in here.
Thank you for your important and timely presentation. Speaking about accountability, do you think that the pharma rush for nonprofit and offering antidotes has anything to do with the new legislation on and presidential commitment of ending the opioid epidemic?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that example that I gave is a result of any legislative or regulatory push. That was really Purdue Pharma trying to salvage its own reputation. And, I guess to the extent that they're more effective at lobbying for their positions in government because they have improved their reputation, maybe it's connected in that sense. But a little indirect. Civica, the other example, that was started by nonprofits. So there are going to be a lot of players in that, and I bet there's going to be some big for-profit players who want to get in on Civica. But that was started by nonprofits, and so I think that's really a play to try to get at the generic drug manufacturers who are limiting the supply and gouging these hospitals on cost and health plans because they're these are not brand name drugs. These are off patent, but they're in very limited supply. So they decided they can do much better by being a manufacturer themselves or contracting out to manufacturers and controlling the manufacturer.
All right, well, let me thank you again. Please join us for a reception out in our lobby over here, and Mr. Jacobs will also be here for a while, both in the room and then out in the lobby, I think, joining us if you have other questions.